Welcome to the Physician's Guide to Financial Wellness, the podcast dedicated to helping physicians in Michigan turn their professional success into financial success while enjoying life along the way. And now, here are your hosts, Andrew Mushbaugh and Trent DeBruin.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Physician's Guide to Financial Wellness. This is Trent DeBruin, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Andrew Mushbaugh. And it's that time of the year where we're heading into open enrollment season for employer benefits, so we thought it would be a good time to do an episode on the topic. And we know that with open enrollment, it can sometimes be confusing trying to navigate it, since employers often provide a lot of information regarding your benefits, but not always as much in the way of guidance or interpretation of that information. So our plan for today's episode is to start by providing some high-level background on open enrollment, then walk through the most important employee benefit areas and what to consider for each one. And our goal is to provide somewhat of an open enrollment checklist for everyone by breaking down the key areas and decisions in a step-by-step manner. And Andrew, with you and I being self-employed and running our own firm the past few years now, we no longer get to experience the joys of open enrollment firsthand.
Well, fortunately, I still get to review Jenny's benefits during open enrollment, but it's 50% less fun this time.
That's right. At least you get 50% of the joy.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, since you still get to share in some of the fun, why don't you kick things off by providing a little bit of background on open enrollment?
Sure. So in basic terms, I start the process by reminding my wife to forward me the emails about opening enrollment.
Yep, definitely an important first step there.
Yeah, but joking aside, open enrollment is the time each year where employees are allowed to make changes to their employee benefits. Things like health insurance plans, group disability insurance, optional life insurance, etc. While there are certain employee benefits you can adjust throughout the year, things like retirement contributions, for most employee benefits, there's a set window each year where you can make changes. Now, the exception here is if you have a qualifying life event throughout the year, such as getting married, getting divorced, or having a baby. If that happens, you're allowed something called a special enrollment period, where you can make changes to your employee benefits outside of the standard enrollment period. But for most people, open enrollment is the only time where you can make these changes. And while the exact timing of open enrollment varies by employer, it tends to be sometime during September or October of each year. For example, U of M's open enrollment period runs from October 18th through October 29th this year. So as you can see, it's not always a long window, and because of that, if you're planning to make any changes to your benefits, it's good to have done your homework and be ready to go with your new elections ahead of time. So that's a little bit about open enrollment in general and the timing of it. And in terms of useful information to have heading into open enrollment, the three most valuable items are your employee benefits guide, usually a big 30 or 40-page PDF, your most recent pay stub, and the current options and cost of your benefits for the upcoming year. The employee benefits guide is helpful because it provides a detailed breakdown of all the different benefits right of your employer, which employees are eligible for each benefit, and the options you can choose within each area, such as the health insurance. And the benefits packet is meant to provide a higher level overview, so there are certain times where you'll need to confirm anything that's unique to your situation with your HR department, but it's a great starting point. As for your pay stub, it's helpful to review because it provides information on your current benefit elections and allows you to see additional details. Some benefits are paid for you by your employer, while others are paid for by you. But either way, the information shows up on your pay stub as either a deduction from your paycheck, either after tax or before tax, or an employer-paid benefit. And the last part of information to review is the options for the upcoming year, along with the cost for each of them. These will change over time, so it's helpful to compare the options and costs to previous years to see the cost or benefit trade-off of what makes the most sense for your situation. So that's an initial overview of open enrollment and some of the things to consider and review ahead of time, but we'll walk through the key benefit areas one by one and talk about them in more detail.
Yeah, and we'll start with health insurance because it tends to be the most significant benefit in terms of the value of it and the amount being deducted from your paycheck. And typically, you'll see 3 different health insurance plans offered by your employer with different features for each of them in terms of deductibles, copays, access to providers, etc., and also different amounts of the premium costs being covered by your employer. The most common situation is to have a PPO option at the expensive end, an HMO option at the cheap end, and a third option that's somewhere in between those two. Generally speaking, the PPO option will provide the greatest flexibility and convenience in terms of freedom to see providers across networks and not needing a referral to see a specialist. The flip side is that PPOs also tend to be the most expensive option since premiums are higher and employers tend to cover a lower percentage of that premium cost. HMOs, on the other hand, tend to be the opposite. These are often the cheapest plans with the largest portion of premiums paid for by employers, but they also carry with them more restrictions in terms of having to see providers within the network or paying more to see providers outside of the network, needing a referral to see a specialist, etc. So one aspect to consider is the cost of premiums and access to providers, but another is out-of-pocket costs for things like deductibles, copays, and maximum out-of-pocket costs. Different health insurance plans will have different features when it comes to this, so you want to take into account the full picture when making your decision. For example, if you're younger and healthier, you might choose a plan that has a higher deductible and higher potential out-of-pocket costs, but lower monthly premiums. And then on the flip side, if you're in a situation where your healthcare costs are likely to be higher, either for you or your family, it might make more sense to pay a higher monthly premium for a plan with lower out-of-pocket costs. And while it's not the most fun thing to do, the best approach is often to run some back-of-the-envelope calculations to figure out your expected total healthcare costs between premiums, out-of-pocket costs, etc., for the various health insurance plans based on your situation and your expected usage. Sometimes employee benefit packets even include these calculations to give you a better idea of the cost for different scenarios. And as nice as it would be if there was a clean black and white answer in terms of the quote-unquote right health plan option for everyone, as a general guideline or rule of thumb, unfortunately, health insurance is one of the many areas of financial planning where the right choice is very case by case depending on the specifics of your unique situation. And if we haven't already thrown out enough things to consider when making the health plan decision, one other factor to keep in mind is health savings accounts. Now, it's worth mentioning that in order to be eligible for a health savings account, or an HSA, you need to be enrolled in a qualifying high-deductible health plan. And not all employers offer health plans that are HSA eligible. But for the employers that do, it can be a really nice benefit. For example, among the local employers, U of M doesn't have an HSA eligible health plan, but Beaumont and Henry Ford both do. As we explained in prior episodes, an HSA is an account that you can contribute money to, receive a tax deduction for your contributions, and then use the money to either pay for out-of-pocket healthcare costs or invest it for the future. In 2021, the maximum HSA contribution limit for a family is $7,200. So for a physician in the 32% marginal tax bracket who contributes the maximum amount, between federal taxes and Michigan state taxes, that would save them more than $2,500 in total taxes. And in addition to the potential tax savings of an HSA, most employers that offer HSA-eligible health plans also contribute some money to the HSA accounts each year, such as $500 or $1,000, which is another potential perk of going with an HSA plan. So when doing your calculations to compare the true costs of different healthcare plans, you'll also want to factor in the value of the tax savings and the amount of any employer contributions to an HSA plan, which makes the numbers look even better. Also, keep in mind that unlike flexible spending accounts, which we'll cover next, money left over in HSA accounts at year-end can be rolled forward to future years. So step one of the open enrollment review is reviewing your health insurance options and making sure you have the right plan based on your situation. And I just touched on it, so this is a good opportunity to jump into the next area to consider, which is flexible spending accounts.
Yeah, while not all employers offer access to a health savings account, almost every employer has some type of flexible spending account or FSA account benefit. And there are two main types of FSAs, one for healthcare and one for dependent care. Similar to a health savings account, a healthcare FSA is an account that you can contribute money to on a pre-tax basis, then use that money to pay for out-of-pocket healthcare expenses, things like deductibles, co-pays, or contacts. A dependent care FSA operates the same way, except for childcare costs, things like daycare or a nanny. The key difference between HSAs and FSAs is that FSAs are quote-unquote use it or lose it accounts, in the sense that the money you contribute for a given calendar year must be used by March 15th of the following year, or you lose it. You also don't have the ability to invest money in FSA accounts or use it for non-qualified expenses after age 65. So as you can see, FSAs are much more restrictive than HSAs. However, if you have a certain amount of out-of-pocket healthcare costs or childcare costs each year, they provide a nice way to save on taxes while paying for things you would pay for anyway. Just to provide some perspective here, the maximum healthcare FSA contribution for 2021 is $2,750. So for that physician in the 32% marginal tax bracket, that would mean approximately $1,000 in combined state and federal tax savings. On the other hand, the 2021 dependent care FSA contribution limit is $5,000. So that's an additional $1,800 in potential tax savings. So for someone who knows they would have $3,000 in out-of-pocket healthcare costs and $5,000 in childcare costs, which is easily met for anyone who has kids in daycare, that's an easy way to save $3,000 in taxes each year by taking advantage of the FSA. And it's worth noting that you don't have to contribute to both a healthcare FSA and a dependent care FSA. You could choose to contribute to one or the other if you want. Now, the key with FSAs is knowing how much you'll have in out-of-pocket healthcare or childcare costs for the coming year. For childcare, that tends to be pretty easy since the cost is visible month to month, and daycare or nanny costs tend to be more than $5,000 each year. Predicting healthcare costs, on the other hand, can be more difficult. But if you're someone who regularly has higher out-of-pocket costs, or if you know you'll be having a baby or having a certain procedure done in the coming year, which will make it a higher cost year, it's possible to have visibility here as well. So when it comes to open enrollment review and flexible spending accounts, step one is to check whether your employer offers an FSA benefit, either healthcare or dependent care. And step two is to think about whether you'll have enough in out-of-pocket costs for either area over the upcoming year that it would make sense to contribute. Now, there are a couple additional things to mention when it comes to FSAs. The first is that your maximum contributions are sometimes capped at a lower level if you earn above a certain amount of income and are therefore considered a higher earner. Second, if you have a health savings account, you aren't eligible to contribute to a healthcare FSA, although you can still contribute to a dependent care FSA. And third, when using an FSA, you do have to keep track of your receipts for your different expenses, whether that's healthcare or dependent care, and reimburse yourself from your FSA. There are some additional logistical details involved, but if you're able to save several $1,000s a year in taxes, the extra effort is probably worth it.
So healthcare and childcare expenses, some fun things to talk about here. Sorry, Andrew, for reminding you about daycare costs, as if you weren't already aware of those month to month.
Yeah, it's just a mini exercise in how it's going to feel when paying for college costs.
Oh, you mean in that rare event that Grant doesn't get that D1 scholarship?
Oh, yeah, no, I thought that went without saying. Obviously, it's a backup plan.
Of course. I assume we were on the same page. And speaking of fun things to talk about, the next item we want to cover is life insurance. So when it comes to life insurance as an employee benefit, the typical situation is that your employer provides some base amount that they pay for, then you have the option to pay for additional coverage beyond that amount. The employer-provided coverage is usually either a token amount, like $30,000 a year, or something a bit higher, like 1 or 2 times your salary. But either way, for physicians who have others depending on their income and therefore have a need for life insurance, the employer-provided coverage is rarely enough for their situation, and their quote-unquote calculated need is higher than that. So step 1 with reviewing your life insurance benefit election is to first step back and figure out what your overall need is for life insurance. The general rule of thumb you typically see thrown around is 8 to 11 times your gross income, but we're hesitant to even mention that because life insurance needs vary dramatically from person to person, depending on things like your age, annual spending, amount of debt, financial goals like retirement or college savings, the amount you have in investments and assets, etc. So your calculated need won't always fit within that general guideline. But regardless of what your need is, once you have that number, you'll want to compare it to your existing life insurance coverage, including your employer-provided group coverage and any individual life insurance coverage you have, to see if there's a gap. If you're already sufficiently covered, there's nothing additional you need to do when it comes to the life insurance portion of the open enrollment review. However, if there is a gap in coverage, you'll want to decide whether to bridge that gap by adding optional group life insurance through your employer or by purchasing an individual policy. And there are pros and cons of group and individual life insurance, but the main pro of group coverage is that it's typically cheaper because you're able to leverage the group purchasing power, and you can purchase up to a certain amount of coverage before having to go through medical underwriting. So if health is a question and would make buying individual life insurance more expensive for you, this is a way to effectively capture a better health rating for insurance purposes. On the flip side, the main downside of group coverage is that it's tied to your employer, so if you change jobs, it goes away. And this may not be an issue if your new employer offers the same type of life insurance benefits, but that isn't always the case, so you can't take it for granted. And if you need to then go out and purchase individual life insurance coverage when you start your new job, it'll cost more at that point since you're older. So just to summarize, when reviewing life insurance for open enrollment, you want to evaluate your overall life insurance needs versus your coverage, then decide whether or not to purchase additional group life insurance coverage to bridge any gaps there.
All right, and sorry to disappoint everyone who thought we were about to move on to happier topics, but the next area we're going to touch on is disability insurance. And as we go through this topic, you'll see there are a lot of similarities to the life insurance discussion. But just as the starting point to provide some context, the way disability insurance works is that it pays you money if you were to become disabled and aren't able to earn income through your work. So similar to life insurance, it's important to have if you have other people relying on your income, like a spouse or kids. However, unlike life insurance, it's also important to have even if you don't have anyone relying on your income. And the reason for that is because if you were to become disabled, you would still need to fund your own living expenses, as well as save for any financial goals you have in the future, such as retirement. Like life insurance, most employers offer some type of group disability insurance, although it tends to be a more meaningful benefit, at least relative to their income. So similar to life insurance, the first step when reviewing disability insurance for open enrollment is to first figure out your overall need for disability insurance. In simple terms, you want to look at how much money your household needs each year to pay for your expenses and also save for any other goals, like retirement or saving for college. And then think about a scenario where your income went away. And in that scenario, how much income you would need to bridge the gap and still cover those expenses and meet those savings targets. That's your calculated quote-unquote need for disability insurance. And step 2 is then to look at your group disability insurance options, both the amount and the details of coverage. At a basic level, the most common group disability insurance is coverage that pays out somewhere around 2/3 of your income if you were to become disabled. However, there's sometimes more than one option you can choose from, such as coverage that also pays out a contribution to your retirement savings plan in addition to the base benefit. A key thing to review with your group disability insurance is the specific type of coverage that you have. When it comes to disability insurance for physicians, An important feature is the own occupation, specialty-specific definition of disability. What this means is that disability insurance with this definition of disability pays out benefits if you're disabled and unable to perform the specific duties of your specialty, regardless of whether or not you could still work in a more limited capacity doing other duties. And there's a big difference between being disabled and no longer being able to do any type of work versus being disabled and no longer being able to perform procedures as a surgeon, but still being able to perform the duties of administrative or lower value work. So this is an important distinction to keep in mind when it comes to disability insurance. And the point as it pertains to group disability insurance is that the nature of the coverage varies from employer to employer. And some group disability insurance carries this own occupation, specialty-specific definition, but some don't. Now, if you think about it, the importance of this definition is going to vary depending on your specialty. For example, if you do a lot of procedures working with your hands and standing for long periods of time, it's more important. On the other hand, if you're in a specialty that isn't as physically demanding and you're mainly relying on your brain, there'd be fewer potential scenarios where you're disabled and not able to perform your specialty, but at the same time, not meeting a general definition of disability. So for the purposes of our open enrollment review, you want to review the nature of your group disability insurance relative to your calculated need in your specialty. You can then decide whether the group coverage is sufficient for your situation, or if you should consider adding individual coverage as well, if you don't already have it. The benefit of individual coverage is that it can be more customized to you and your specialty, and it follows you around wherever you go, even if you change employers and move to one that doesn't offer as good of group coverage. The main drawback, on the other hand, is that individual coverage is much more expensive than group coverage. So it's a matter of weighing the trade-offs and what you're comfortable with.
All right, on to a more uplifting topic of retirement and planning for that. And specifically, the last item we want to cover here is checking in on and confirming your retirement savings contributions. And we saved this one for the end because while open enrollment isn't the only time of the year when you're allowed to change your retirement plan contributions, you're allowed to make changes here at any point throughout the year. It's a great time to revisit and check in on things to make sure you're optimizing everything. As we talked about in prior episodes, each person is eligible to contribute to certain retirement accounts through their employer, whether that's a 401k, 403b, 457b, etc. So presumably at some point in the past, whether when you first started your job or more recently, you would have looked through the different retirement savings options and decided which accounts you'd like to contribute to. And if not, then now's a great time to go through and review this for the first time. The reason it's a good idea to revisit your contributions around open enrollment time is that each account has certain maximum annual contribution limits, and these limits increase over time. For example, the current maximum annual contribution to a 403b for someone under age 50 is $19,500. However, in 2018, that number was $18,500, and 10 years ago, it was $16,500. So every year or two, the IRS tends to bump up these maximum contribution limits by $500 or $1,000. And there's also a step change in contribution limits once you reach age 50, since the IRS then allows you to make an additional catch-up contribution. For example, while someone under age 50 can contribute $19,500 to their 403b for 2021, someone age 50 or older is allowed to contribute an additional $6,500 or $26,000 in total. So open enrollment is a good time to check in and see how much you've contributed to your accounts year to date and how much you're contributing on a monthly basis to make sure you're maxing out all the accounts that you want to max out. And if you find that you aren't on pace to hit the maximum contribution for the year, this is a good opportunity to bump up your contributions since you still have at least a couple paychecks left for the year, so you have time to catch up and hit that maximum. And going back to what we mentioned earlier about your pay stub containing a lot of useful information, the same is true with retirement contributions. When you check your pay stub, you can see how much you've contributed to the various employer retirement plans on a year-to-date basis, as well as how much you've contributed from your most recent paycheck, which will allow you to understand whether or not you're on track.
And just to wrap things up, one last item we want to mention with the open enrollment review is about the ancillary benefits out there. Things like dental insurance, vision insurance, or a legal service plan. And we don't tend to spend as much time on these benefits because they're smaller with smaller costs, so decisions here don't move the needle as much in the big picture. It's nice to have dental and vision insurance, and the decision here is typically whether you want a PPO type plan that has more freedom to see different providers, but is also more expensive, versus an HMO type plan that's more restrictive. And given the smaller costs involved, it's really just a personal preference in terms of what works best for you. And when it comes to things like the legal service plan, we'll say that from our experience, you typically get what you pay for. So if you're putting in place estate planning documents like a will, trust, or powers of attorney, it's often best to just get connected with a good local attorney who can help you with the process. You'll pay more going this route, but you'll also likely have a better service experience with less work required on your end. And when it comes to important documents like these, it's nice to have the peace of mind that everything is done correctly. So just wanted to touch on a few of those quote-unquote other items to round out that discussion.
Yeah, thanks for adding that. Well, hopefully this was helpful for everyone in terms of providing some context behind open enrollment, as well as a blueprint to follow when reviewing the different areas. It's something that's not always the most exciting to go through, but fortunately, once you do a deep dive in a particular year and put some thought into your benefit elections and making sure they're aligned with your situation, in future years it becomes more maintenance mode, where you check the box for key items and then only need to make any bigger changes when your life situation changes. And just to give a quick recap of the different areas we covered, number 1 is health insurance. So make sure you have the health insurance plan that fits your unique situation and healthcare usage in terms of weighing the cost of premiums with out-of-pocket costs, deductibles, copays, while also providing the right access to providers. Number 2 is flexible spending accounts. If you know you'll have a certain amount of childcare costs or out-of-pocket healthcare costs over the coming year, consider contributing to a dependent care or healthcare FSA to save on taxes for money you're spending anyway. Number 3 is life insurance. Figure out your calculated life insurance need, then compare it to your existing coverage, both employer-provided and individual, to see if there's any gap. And if there is, weigh the cost of purchasing additional group coverage with the potential drawback of knowing that coverage wouldn't follow you if you did change employers. Number 4 is disability insurance. Review the specifics of your group disability insurance, including amount and type of coverage, and compare it to your calculated need and the trade-offs you're comfortable with to determine whether you should add any individual disability insurance as well, if you don't already have it. And lastly, number 5 is retirement plan contributions. Use open enrollment as an opportunity to check in on your year-to-date and ongoing retirement plan contributions to make sure you're maximizing the accounts you want to maximize. And if needed, make any adjustments to your ongoing contributions for the remainder of the year to hit those maximums. Well, thank you, as always, for joining us for another episode of the show. You can find the show notes and links for the episode at mdwmllc.com/podcast. We'll also include in there a link to a PDF guide we have called the Toolkit for Optimizing Your Finances as an Employed Physician. It's a pretty comprehensive guide and it walks through a bunch of different areas to consider when managing your finances, but it ties in with our discussion today since it touches on a number of the areas we covered. So if you're interested, feel free to grab a copy of that. And take care, everyone, and we'll look forward to talking to you again soon.
Want even more ideas, tools, and resources on how to make smart financial decisions? Check out the resources section of MD Wealth Management's website at mdwmllc.com, where you'll find additional knowledge and insight from Michigan physicians, including a blog, ebook, and one-page guides. While there, you can also schedule a 15-minute conversation with Andrew and Trent to learn more about what it means to work with the firm and how they serve physicians. If you've enjoyed the content, please leave a review on iTunes and share with your friends and colleagues. Thanks so much for listening. Andrew Mushbaugh and Trent DeBruin are certified financial planners, principals, and co-founders of MD Wealth Management, a registered investment advisory firm in the state of Michigan. All opinions shared in the show are for general information and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and no guarantee of future returns. Please consult with your legal advisor, your tax advisor, or your financial advisor before making any decisions.